Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever your time zone is. Thank you so much for joining us today with Ted Pattinson's 5th Power BI Dev Camp. And today we are, sorry, there we are, I just turned off that reminder. Today Ted will be walking us through embedding Power BI reports using React.JS. So if you're not familiar with Ted, he has some great blogs. He has some great content on GitHub. Please go to our blog here. Just pop that in the link to find out more. We also have a ton of information on community.powerbi.com. Well, without further ado, let's have Ted take it away. Thanks so much, Ted, for presenting today.
Thanks very much, Kelly. A warm welcome to everyone. Hope everyone's having a good time as we enter the holiday season. Seems some of you up north got a lot of snow. Okay, let's go ahead and start out what we're going to talk about. Just a quick call out. The schedule that we have going forward and some other important links we have in our little portal there at powerbidevcamp.net. And also, a lot of what we're going to cover in this section is going to build on the Power BI JavaScript API. So if you have seen session 3, I think that will be very helpful. If you watch this and it doesn't make as much sense, then maybe you go back and watch session 3 where we kind of drill into the Power BI JavaScript API. That might be helpful as well. So to some degree, this is a prerequisite. Now, the program for today, we're going to start just with some basics, because I don't know how much any of you have used React.JS. I sense there's probably some people that have never used it and are kind of curious what it is. Other people probably know far more than me and have far more experience working with this library. The other thing we're going to do is once we kind of discuss what React.JS is and how you use it, then we're going to use it in a very special way. We're going to create a single page application using React.JS, but we're not going to use JavaScript. We're going to use TypeScript, and we're going to use a Node.js environment which uses webpack to build our application, into a very small number of files to distribute. Along the way, because we want to talk to the Power BI Service API, we have to authenticate the user using Azure AD. And I'm going to do a demo where I download the sample app and soup the nuts. We'll just create an Azure AD application by hand so we can get the application up and running. We're going to look at something which is called the React router. That's an important part of creating a non-trivial React application. Now here we're not using any server-side code, so you can't use .NET, .NET Core, .NET 5, Node.js on the server side. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be calling into the Power BI Service API, directly from the client, from the browser, using the Fetch API that's built into React. And then we're going to concentrate on the part that allows us to embed the Power BI reports. And at the very end, we're going to look at a React component that's been released by Microsoft and the Power BI team, and just give you a quick exposure to what the Power BI React component is and how you can use it. Okay, let's go ahead and start. So if you're brand new to React, it's basically a library for building user interfaces or user interface experiences. Now, there are some other JavaScript frameworks like Angular or AngularJS that are supposed to be all-encompassing, where React bites off a much smaller part of what it wants to do. It focuses on building HTML-based user experiences, and it really tries to create it in a component-based architecture. And the idea is that if you're creating a component that's going to go somewhere on a page that has lots of other components, you want your component to be isolated. You don't want a JavaScript function or a CSS rule to basically conflict with another on the page. So there are ways that we can kind of build component-based architectures. Now, one thing that's really neat about React components is how we write the code that does something in response to a user action, clicking on a button, moving from one view to another. So the idea is that you write code that reacts to things that happen. You're also going to see that React has this very efficient processing model, which has something which we call the shadow DOM. And the idea is that if your code is on a page, with hundreds or thousands of other developers who have worked on that page, we have to be very, very performant. So what React does is it creates kind of a parallel DOM And as your code moves through and sets up things like event handlers, after you're done, it's able to take what's in the shadow DOM and transfer it back to the real DOM. So you're not going to be doing things, such as enumerating through, thousands of HTML elements on a page. And React was first created for Facebook. And as you can tell, Facebook pages are very crowded, so if it wasn't a very, efficient way to process things, React would have never taken off. Now, to get started, there are two actual libraries that we're going to use. There's React and something called the React DOM. So think of React as the part that is abstract and isn't hard-coded to the browser or any native device. And then there's a second part that bootstraps you into a particular type of environment, like behind the browser. So the React DOM, is what we use to kind of bootstrap our first React component on the page. And if I wasn't creating an HTML-based application, I was creating something for a native application on some device like an iPhone, there are different React libraries that let you bootstrap into those environments as well. Now, some of the things to see at a high level, let's say that we're creating a React component and we're just using regular old JavaScript, what I'll call ECMAScript 5, the version of JavaScript that we still consider today as wide reach. There's a new ECMAScript that's a little bit like TypeScript because it has keywords like class in it. But let's say that you're just using the older version of JavaScript that most of us are used to. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a component by calling react.createClass. And the only requirement for a React component is it has to have a render method. So the idea is when it's time to render, the underlying architecture calls the render method, and it's able to return an HTML fragment. Okay, now, some of the things to see is that when we start using React, because the people that created React anticipated being used in future versions of JavaScript ES6 that has the keyword class, and maybe in TypeScript, we can't use the keyword class as an HTML attribute. So when we start working with React, we have to use className instead of class. Quite often I'm creating a React application and I copy and paste a bunch of HTML from a regular web application, into my React code. And the first thing you have to do is go and change class to className everywhere, because it won't compile if you don't do that. Okay. Now, another thing about React is it likes objects. So let's say that I wanted to set a style on an element. So I can create an element. You can see the code right there. We create an element, just a JavaScript object. It's got an ID. And then when I set the style property, I set it to an object, not a string. So once again, as you get up and going with React, there are some things that we have to get used to. Now, here's something that's also going to be important to call out as you're getting started with React. The way that you handle events, someone clicking on a button, clicking on an anchor tag. We use synthetic events. So if you look at that yellow arrow down there, notice that the attribute is not onClick with a small c as defined in the DOM. It's onClick with a capital C. So that's a synthetic event. And the idea is that when we use synthetic events, it's able to register everything in the virtual DOM. And then when it sees that, it's ready, it's able to kind of transfer what you've done to the actual DOM in the page down below. But some of the things that people really like about the way that we handle events in React is that it provides fast and simple registration, and there's no need to write browser-specific code. Gone are the days where you have to write code that says, if IE 8 and earlier, do this, if everything else, do that. Okay. Now, the last basic concept before we jump in and start doing something interesting is to understand something which is called JSX. So when they create a React, you're basically writing JavaScript code, maybe TypeScript code, but you have to compile HTML fragments. So if you had to parse together HTML, just by using strings and the plus sign or some other technique, that would be very tedious. So what they did is they created something called JSX, and it allows you, while you're writing JavaScript, to basically write HTML fragments, like you see on the page there. Now, the regular browser doesn't understand these. So when we use JSX, you need some kind of a compiler that can take your friendly HTML that you have in your JavaScript code and compile it into the equivalent JavaScript code that's understood by the browser. So if you were using JavaScript, typically you use the Babel compiler to transpile your JSX into JavaScript. Now, we're going to be using TypeScript, so the TypeScript compiler is up to the job of being able to take all our TSX code and basically transform it, into JavaScript that will run inside the browser. Okay, lots of theoretical stuff so far. Now is where the rubber meets the road. So we want to create a single page application. And so we want to use React.JS, but we're also going to use TypeScript and Webpack. Now, what you're going to see is that if you use the older version of JavaScript, which is ECMAScript 5, or the newer version, which is ECMAScript 6, or you use TypeScript, there's 3 very different types of syntax you will use when using React.JS. Now, what I found when I got started with this about 2 or 3 years ago is that TypeScript was the hardest thing to learn because there was no samples. All the good React books are done with JavaScript. But reading some blog entries and figuring out what the syntax was, once I got it down, I think programming React with TypeScript is far better, than doing it with, either the older or the newer flavor of JavaScript. So here's an example. So we're going to say import star as React from the React library. So you have to add the package for React. And then you're going to create a component. Export class my component extends React.component. Now you'll see 2 things that say any and any. So we're going to leave these guys shrouded in mystery for a second. But the idea is that once you want to create a component, all you have to do, your only requirement, is to basically implement the render method. And then here is hello world, where what are you returning? You're returning TSX. And also note to use TSX, the file extension is going to change from TS to TSX. Now, once we've done that, we're going to be able to kind of create the application. Now I have a couple applications I'm going to show here. So let's kind of move over to this first one, is my simple React demo. And so what I have here is I have an app.tsx file. Now, what you're going to see is that we're going to use this utility, which is called Webpack. And Webpack is a utility that's going to take all these files. You see app.tsx, app.cs. What's kind of neat about this when you get started is that you can say import a CSS file into your TSX file, and Webpack knows how to automatically take that set of CSS rules and basically embed it into the JavaScript it's going to be creating. Okay, so let's say that I just want to go ahead and run this right here. So note, if I go back, let's kind of look at this one file, which is called package.json. If you've never done Node.js style development, where you're using Node Package Manager to basically add your references, that's what we're using here. So you can see that this base package, has Webpack. I'm using Webpack version 4. If you move to an earlier or later version, typically Webpack gives you some migration headaches to figure it out as you move to a different version. But I have version 4 right here. And then there's all kinds of things that we're using here, like the copy Webpack plugin and the clean Webpack plugin. So the idea is, as you run the Webpack utility, you have this one particular file right here, which is called Webpack config. And it says, what is your entry point? And so the idea is when I start a compilation, it's going to start right here at index.tsx. Okay, now if I go take a quick look at index.tsx, index.tsx references other libraries inside here, including components.app. And what's kind of neat about Webpack is that you only have to point to one file, and it's going to find that file and also see, hey, this references another file with import. So let's go back here and reference this. And notice that this one, references other components as well. Now, in addition to pulling all the code that you've written into a single file. It goes further than that. And, what it will do is it will pull in libraries, such as bootstrap.js. So it's going to pull in third-party libraries and all the code for React as well. Now, if I want to test this, let's go back here and notice that if I say npm run start, and inside of the package.json file, you can see that what is it going to mean when I say run start? It's basically to run the webpack server command. And so, now I can go ahead and run this right here, and my application starts up. And when you're using the webpack dev server, one of the things that's kind of neat is, let's go back here, let's go down, and now we'll say something like here, and now I'll go ahead and hit save. And notice that it has file watching, so it's kind of watching things on the fly, so it makes it very easy for you to change things. And the last thing for this intro demo that I'll show, is let's say that here I've been running and testing, in the Webpack dev server. And so now that I've done that, let's go ahead and this time we're going to do a npm run build. So let's say I'm all done developing, and now we're going to go ahead and build. And what's going to happen is it's going to put everything out to this distribution folder. If I go down here and we take a look at what is inside the distribution folder, there's basically an HTML file, and there is a single JavaScript file. So basically, let's go back here. Let's go ahead and run this. And one of the things that I want to point out, with this particular demo right here, is that there's an image file right here, but yet when we look in the distribution file, there's no image. And so, as you start using, things like Webpack, what you're going to see is that here I've imported a CSS file, and inside of the CSS file, it references a background image and the Webpack process. And just to kind of call it out inside here, we have something which is called the style and CSS loader. That is able to take that image and basically convert it into a base64 string, so it can be added to CSS, which is added to the JS file. If you come back here and you kind of take a look at what is inside of that JavaScript file, that's all the work you did in a much better language, basically, which is TypeScript, not JavaScript, but yet it emits a single JavaScript file, generated by a machine, that has all your CSS and stuff inside. Now, going just a little bit further, I kind of walk through, using this right here. And there's also, as you're building a React application, typically you have a top level component, which we, traditionally call the app component. And the first thing we need to do is figure out, how to bootstrap that in. So notice that in this application, like many people will do, they'll have an index.ts file, and the index.ts file will basically, be the one that calls render. And where's render from? Here's the one place, inside of our application, you can see that's React DOM, that the render method allows me to, basically bootstrap that into a page. Okay. Now, if you look back here at, what does the HTML file look like? It's as simple as possible, and it just has one target div. And so now when we look at index.html, it basically just gets the DOM object, for that div and calls render. And now here's the app object that we have. Now, just a quick walkthrough here. When we look at the app object, if I come back here and we kind of take a look at this page, it looks like a single page, but to the user, it's got a banner, it's got a top nav, so all these kind of components are isolated. And so if I come back here and, make a quick, change to these right here, and I hit enter, and now let's go ahead and, run this one more time. And just it allows you to kind of put everything, into separate components, as you start, building out your application. And just the isolation and the component-based nature, makes it very easy to reuse code, makes it very easy to abstract away things that can't be overwritten, by other components on the page that might have used similar naming conventions, as I have. Okay, so what we've seen so far is that we can create React component hierarchies. Now, another very important part about React, and here you're going to take a step back and you're going to think about how you design an application. So in React, you create components, and by default, they have no properties or states, but you're going to start adding property and state. And the idea is that if a component has properties, they don't initialize their own properties. Typically, a parent component will create a child component and pass the properties in. So as the child component looks at its properties, it doesn't change them. They're changed by the parent, something external. Now, also note that properties are read-only. So if a parent passes a property to a child component, it cannot change those. Now, state, on the other hand, is what components use to do their rendering. And the idea is that a component defines its state, and whenever the state changes, the component knows to re-render itself. That's basically what's built into the philosophy of how React works. Now, once again, we're using TypeScript. So if we weren't using TypeScript, the syntax would be completely different. So the first thing that we're going to do, let's look at component1.tsx, is that we're going to create an interface. And here we'll have a single property name. But what you can see is that when your component extends React.component, instead of passing any as that first argument, you're going to pass an interface name. And that's automatically going to light up props inside here. Okay, let's go back here. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over and I'm going to open another very simple application. And I promise right after this one, we'll jump into Power BI. But what I wanted to show here is let's create a bean counter component. And there's two things we care about. We care about properties. So here I've named the first interface bean counter props. And note that this is typically a property that's used to initialize this component, and it's set by some other party. Now we also want state, because a bean counter has to know how many beans it has. So we're going to have the state property inside here. Now let's go back over to the app that's going to create this component. So here I want a bean counter component, and let's go here, and as I have this bean counter, I get this error. And basically it's saying you got an error because a bean counter, requires a start count. One of the things that you could do, is you could kind of make this a optional argument, and then this is fine. But let's say that it doesn't make sense to create this, without a particular starting count. So we'll put that in there. And now what you're going to see, and notice that we have and we're going to go ahead and put that at a value of 1. So the idea is that when this thing gets created, starting count is 1, but we can't change that. So instead we have a second interface that has our count. And so now I'm going to set the state here. Okay, now let's go ahead and run this guy. And so as I run this right here, what we should see here is that, as it comes up, not the most exciting demo in the world, but I go ahead and click on this and we get, a count. And so what you can see here is here's my rendering. We're going to go ahead and create a button, and on click, we're going to say add new bean. So as I click this, what's going to happen, it's basically going to run this right here. And because I'm a React component, I can always say this dot props to see my properties, or this dot state, to basically see my state inside there. So here, we're basically going to get the new count, and then we're going to go ahead and call set state. And the reason set state is important is whenever a component sets its state, and you might have 5 properties and only set 1, render fires again. So the idea is that each time you click this, it sets the state to something else, and this render method runs again. Okay, so that was kind of a whirlwind tour of getting started with React, working with TypeScript and webpack, so I can have a very modern way to, take a very complicated project and build it into a very small number. In many cases, just a single HTML file and a single JavaScript file is what you need to distribute. Okay, now what we're going to do now is we're going to move into authenticating users with Azure AD. This is also the point now where I'm going to go ahead and use the sample application that we've created. Okay, now we have a sample application, and with this particular sample application, I think what I'll also do is put this now, into our event inside here. Let's see if we can get that question in, just so you can have the URL I'm about to use. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this URL, and I better go back here and let me get back to the browser. And so what I can do, if I can move this thing over here and maximize the screen, let's now go to this URL. And so the sample code I have to show you is kind of the starter app. Now, there's a couple different ways that you could take this code and add it to your machine. For instance, you could say download zip archive. And if I say download zip, it's going to download that. I can open it up and use it from there. Okay, let's look at a second way. So let's say that I go back to this demos folder right here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my npm command line. And, let's do a cd, and we'll cd over to this folder right here. Now, the way I'm going to show you, if you have the utility git, G-I-T, it's what you say to your dog when she gets too close to the garbage can, git. So I'm going to go down here, and this time, when I use this, okay, my machine is frozen up. Now it's back. We're going to take this. Let's go back to our command line. For effect, let's have this showing in the background. And we're going to say git clone. And now with git clone, and I'm going to do that in lowercase, git clone. Now let's go ahead and paste that URL. And at this point, it could create it wherever your cursor is. But another thing that I like to do is now let's go ahead and say dev camp, and we'll just kind of call this one live demo. And the idea is now we can go through here, and that's going to kind of copy all that code down. And so now if we cd into the live demo, and now that I've done that, another trick with Visual Studio Code, if you're in the right folder, you say code space dot, and that opens Visual Studio Code, at the folder that you want. Now, here's how you're going to get this project running. Step number 1 is that it defines a whole bunch of packages that don't get downloaded until you run a command. Okay, now you will have to have Node.js installed, so you have something which is called npm. And now we're going to call npm install. And so now this is going to download, all those particular packages. Okay, now once we get all the packages downloaded, we're ready to run this. However, we have to have an Azure AD application. So if I go into the source directory, notice that there is a file which is called app settings. So here, we're going to have to put our domain, and then we're also going to have to get an app workspace that we want to point to. So let's go and start with Power BI devcamp.net. So basically, and spelling is very important here. Doesn't have to be case correct, but it does have to have the right letters in the right sequence. Okay, and so then we need the app workspace ID. So the way this app is built is you point it to one app workspace, and it's going to allow you to embed things that are inside there. So I'm going to go to Power BI, and inside of Power BI, I'm going to go to a workspace that I know has some reports inside of it. And if I go reach, inside the URL here, what we can see is that there is the GUID right behind groups, for our workspace. So let's go ahead and add that here. Right. Okay, now we need the client ID. But before we get the client ID, we got to create a new Azure AD application. Luckily, that's pretty simple to do. So now let's do this. Let's go back to Azure, and I'm going to go to the Azure portal, and note that I have to be in the same tenant where I was for Power BI. And so now what we're going to do is I'm going to click on New Registration. Let's go ahead and call this one Live Demo. And down here under the redirect URL, we'll go ahead and we'll put localhost 8080. That's just basically when you use the webpack dev server, that's what it uses. So let's go ahead and click that. Okay, now I've created it, and there is the application ID, also known as client ID. We'll click that. We'll go back here, and now I've got the 3 settings I need in app settings. Now, one thing to note is that this uses the JavaScript library for the Microsoft Authentication library using the V2 endpoint. And so one of the aspects of using that is that your application has to support what's called implicit grant. And the idea of implicit grant is that you have to turn this on, because without that, Azure AD will not return an access token back to the browser. So if I was creating a .NET application with server-side code, I wouldn't need implicit grant. It's just when you want the entire authentication process and the access token returned back to the client, we have to use implicit grant. Okay, so now we've set up our Azure AD application. Once again, if I kind of come back here and I take a look at this workspace, I see it has a couple different reports and a dashboard and a couple different data sets. So now let's go back here. And so now that I've created the app, I've set app settings, there's only one command that you have to know here. And notice that it is start. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a npm run start. So this should start up the application. And what you can see here is that this application starts up. And remember, it's a single page application. It's not going to go to another page. It's just a bunch of JavaScript running behind the page. And so the first thing I'm going to do is click the sign in link. Now, the way this application is built, let's go down and look at components. So note that we have a app component. And if I go down here, notice the app component has a lot of stuff in it. And so I'm going to quickly go down and look at the render method. But what we can see, up top here is that there is a banner. Okay, there's the banner component, and it just kind of creates a top section of the page with what you'd expect in a banner. And then there is a div here, where we're going to put the app title. Okay, great. And then down here, here's kind of a special one where the banner doesn't have to know what the app is going to put inside of it, because there is a generic this.props.children. So when you look at the app right here, what you'll see is the app creates a banner, and then inside of the banner object, it adds the login. Okay, so if we look at this login works in conjunction with the service class. So what we're going to see here is that there is a sign in button. So what's going to happen when someone clicks the sign in button? So when someone clicks this sign in button, on the on click, we're going to go to this.user.props.login. Okay, so if I look back here, there is this.state.user. So the application object has its state, And so one of the things that the application has is a user object. And at first, it's going to be authenticated equals false, no display name. But also note that we have a login user and log out user method. And here is where I'm kind of taking code that's generic. I want to be reusable. And now this doesn't have to be in the TSX file. It can go in its own service class. So here we have the SPA authentication service. Now note that when I talk to the Power BI API, I'm going to have to get an access token. So I'm going to have the client ID. You can see that we're just kind of pulling those off the app settings. There's also a string array of permissions, what we call scopes that we're going to need when we talk to Power BI. Okay. Now, there's also an MSL configuration, but what I wanted to kind of do is let's get down to the login. What's going to happen when someone clicks this login method right here? Okay, what's going to happen is that someone clicks on this and I've got it to login pop-up. Now we bring up this pop-up object. And what I want you to do is I've already logged in and it's cached my login, which usually is great, but not for demoing the initial experience. So I'm going to go ahead and clear my settings. And one more time, let's go back here and note as I log in, it asks the user to log in. And I don't have to implement any of this. This is all implemented by a Microsoft class right here. Login pop-up. I pass the scopes that I want. And if login successful, we're going to fall inside here. So note also that once you log in, the very first time, it's going to present the user with a set of permissions. So the first time the user logs in, the user will then have to say, I accept the permissions that the application has requested. And then the next time the user logs in, the user won't have to do that anymore. Okay. But what I wanted to kind of show here is that now, we're able to log the user in, we're able to log the user back out. Great. If I go ahead and click sign in, let's log the user in one more time. And what's kind of neat about this library, so back here, the library is the Microsoft Authentication Library. And so some of the things that we can do is that we're going to create this thing which is called a user agent. And here's log in, here's log out. But later on, I'm going to need to get an access token. And what's neat about this library is it automatically implements access and refresh token caching in the browser. And if there is a token in the browser, if I try to acquire, it can say acquire token silent and automatically get it, without the need to interact with the user. You can also see that the code here is going to try to acquire a token silently from the cache. If that doesn't work, it falls back and does an acquire token with a pop-up inside here. Okay, but what you see here is that now, we've created a component and our component lets us log in, log out. Let me log out one more time. I want you to see is that if I go back to the app component, and there's this thing which is called the top nav. And so we can say this.state.user is authenticated. And if that user is authenticated, I want to show the top nav. If not, show nothing. So watch what happens here when the user logs in. Once the user logs in, we basically change that one property, user is authenticated, and all of a sudden our links show up so users can get to these places. Okay, let's go down here. You've been watching a lot of technical stuff. Let's just do a little visual gratification of, being able to go and start doing things, like getting to the reports that I want to expose. Okay. Now, what I just showed you, if you wanted to get this application up and going, it's pretty simple. You create that Azure AD application. Make sure you set the implicit flow for access token. And then it's simply a matter of filling in app settings and doing an npm run start. And I just kind of walked through the authentication piece, and all the logic for those is in the React component login.tsx and that one service class that I created, SP auth service. Okay, now if we keep going through here, the next thing I want to do is explain something which is called the React router. So the React router is a separate library that you add. And the reason that we do it, the reason we add this component is that we want a single page application to seem like it's really not a single page application, but a multi-page application. We want the user to say, take me to page 2, 3, and 4. However, we don't want to actually do postbacks to the server. We just want the code behind our app to allow the user to get to another view, but we want to handle everything, with client-side logic. So that's what the React router is for. The React router allows you to define different routes. So, for instance, using the React router, in my application object, I can put in a switch parameter, and notice that switch, is a component defined by the React router DOM. And once I have a switch, I can basically say when I go to one of these paths, such as the root or /customers or /about, I want to load in a particular component. That way you can move from route 1 to route 2 to route 3, and it simply loads in a component without going anywhere. But it's very, very fast. Okay, now the React router allows you to put in a special component, which is called a nav link. And the idea with the nav link is that you can specify, where you would like to go to, and it's going to be a particular route. Okay, now just if I go back to our application, what I want to do is, let's go back up to the top nav. And what you can see in top nav, I have routes that are /dashboards, /reports, /datasets. And the idea is when you click on this, you're going to get to one of these different routes inside here. And here is the switch. And you can see that if we're automatically, at the home page, just show the home page. And the home page has the ability for you to look at it with anonymous access or log in and see a different view. But then I have these routes /dashboards. And then there's going to be one more thing here. And that is, if I say /dashboards and it sees a GUID behind that, it's going to know to embed the dashboard of that particular GUID. Okay. Now, if you look at how this application works, what you can see here is that if I navigate to dashboards, what it's going to do is it's going to make a request to get the dashboards in that particular workspace. So it can basically put them here. Same thing with reports, same thing with data sets. Note that if I look at a report and I actually click on that, up here you can kind of see that the routing we're going to use, basically is going to automatically add the GUID in there. Okay, now as we go back here, let's look at reports. So there is this subcomponent, which is called view reports. And notice that when you call this, we're going to pass the application object. So now let's go down here and we're going to look at view reports. Now, when I look at view reports, because we want to pull the URL out, has to have some special, a special interface for properties that has the route component props. Okay, it's particularly tricky part if you're working through it for the first time. But the idea is that when we look at this view, what we'd like to do, here is our application has state that has reports. So as someone clicks on reports right here, and we'd like to kind of show the reports, what gets to be a common approach is that when render fires, we'll look at the reports, which is an array, and say map. And the idea is that this kind of gives you the ability to create a template, and to create this li with an inner a tag. And now I have code, which is basically going to switch this from reports to reports plus the GUID on the end. Once again, if I come here and now I click on a report, you can see that now you kind of push the GUID inside there. Now, given that, let's look at this component, which is called embedded report.
Hey, Ted, can I just jump in here? We have a quick question about the access token from username Andrew LSN. I think it's Andrew. He's asking, isn't the access token visible at the client this way? So isn't this a security risk?
It matters, how secure your environments are. If you're using Microsoft Word, there's access tokens, for SharePoint on your machine. But, there's different levels of risk. And you put an access token on a machine of a human being that has the username and password to get that access token. And so to me, in a severe lockdown environment, that might be disallowed. Other environments might disallow access tokens in the browser at all. Certainly by keeping the access tokens on the server, things will be safer. But there are many applications that bring access tokens back to the client. And the only way to really prevent that is to have a much more elaborate architecture that has a web service API and the browser's all calling back. And instead of using user owns data embedding, we'd have to use app owns data embedding. So then you'd be able to kind of get an embed token, which is the Power BI security token, not an Azure AD security token. But some people could argue that is dangerous as well. But Power BI embedding does require an access token, whether it's an Azure AD access token or a Power BI embed token to be pushed to the browser. So I'm not trying to dismiss your security concerns, but there are many environments, that this is acceptable for. Okay, great question. Now let's keep going here. And so what I want to now do is let's get back here to the embed report. So now what we have is we have this component. Now, one of the things that this component has to do is it has to basically scrape off the GUID from the end of the URL. And so this .props.match, this is basically the way it's able to do that. But one of the things that we want, let's go back to this application. You can see this one ends with a 3. What if it ends, with a 2? What I wanted to do, is to, have some type of a way to kind of have some good error handling in place right here. So we look at this ID right here, and we kind of are able to find the report. And if it's a bad ID, I can report on that, but if it's no report ID, well, you can see that here, if there is no report ID, you just got to the reports page. So basically we say click report in left nav to open it. And if the GUID is a good GUID, now what we're going to do is we're going to say, basically we are going to return the embed container. Okay, we're going to put an embed toolbar there as well. And then down here, we also have something that's going to call out to our service, which is the Power BI embedding service. Now, I could have put all the code right here, but what I assume it's always going to be more reusable, if you can factor your code out. So all the code that talks to the Power BI service API, lives inside a Power BI embedded service. And so the idea is that we have one to call to embed a dashboard, one to embed a dashboard tile. When it's time to embed a report, here we're going to go ahead and create a config object. We're going to call Power BI embed, and we're going to basically, be able to embed that component inside here. Just a couple more things here. Notice that I wanted, once the report gets embedded, I want my application to still interact with it. So here's an example of toggling edit back and forth. So as we created this embedded report, one of the things that we wanted to do is have a embedded toolbar. And the embedded toolbar, needs a reference to the embedded report. And if I take a quick look at the embedded toolbar, I just have a couple buttons here, but what you can see here is that we're able to call into the Power BI service API, to basically do things like turn filter panels on and off or jump in and out of edit mode. Okay, so what I wanted to do there is kind of step through and kind of show how you can get the example up and running. If you look into the Power BI Service API class, you'll see that it uses just the regular React Fetch API. And the idea is that you can call the Fetch API, but you're going to have to put the access token, inside of the authorization header. So there's just kind of a simple example that shows you, how to do that. Now, I just stepped through embedding reports. So I think I got a couple minutes and I want to get to our last topic here, which is the Power BI React component. So the Power BI React component has been built by the Power BI team. So for people who are already familiar with React, but don't know as much about the Power BI JavaScript API, this component can do some pretty neat things. So first of all, you have to go to this repository. And once you get to that repository, you're going to be able to get to and download, all the repository code. So let me get this URL. Once I've got this URL here, let's go back here. Let's go back to this place right here. And what I've done is I've downloaded the entire repo. Now, there's also a way to say npm install and just install the component, but not all the other things. But if you download the entire thing, there's actually a demo that you can run. So let's say you download the entire Power BI Client React repository. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. I'm now going to go ahead and open a folder. And if I go back here, here is the Power BI Client React Master. We're going to open that thing up. Now, if you wanted to, you could go ahead and build, so do an npm I. So the first time you download it, you'll have to do that inside there. But now, let's say that I open up this package.json file. So here are all the commands that they've made available to us. And there's one which is install demo and run the demo. So the idea is that there's a little folder inside here that kind of shows you how to use this component. So let's do that. Let's do an npm run and install demo. And once I have done that, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call npm run demo. And this will actually run the demo right here. Okay, now when this thing starts up, I'm going to click on embed report. And that's going to basically get the information, that is needed inside there. And so once this thing comes back up, let me go ahead and refresh. And okay, click the embed report to show the access token. Why is this not working? Maybe it's not working because Ted forgot to shut down the other application that was taking the same. Okay, one more time. Let me see if I can run this successfully, just so you can kind of see what you're supposed to do to get it up and running. Okay, so we'll go ahead. We will run this. And hopefully this time I click on report, and now it's gotten the token back. Okay, now let me just spend a quick minute diving into what we just saw there. So here is the demo application. Now, the first thing to see is that this demo, it prevents you from having to do anything with Azure AD. And so the people that created this demo were very clever. Let's say I go back here and I put in this URL. So whenever you do that, they're just able to pull back the ID, the embed URL, and an embed token, from a web service call that just kind of creates that dynamically on the fly. And there's a report back there that we can log into. Okay. But what you can see here is that, when it becomes time to use this particular component right here, there is the demo app. If I go down here just a little bit lower to where we get into, the actual, so here's the component, and you can see that they've created things like the embed configuration, but we also have things like event handlers that I want to be able to hook up, or I want to be able to use a CSS name, or I want to be able to, get the embedded component. So when they created this Power BI embed component, they made it pretty flexible. And, the idea is that I can add event handlers inside here. And I'm sorry, I'm jumping around here. Here is, how you can create a map. So the idea is when you use this component, which events are supported by the Power BI report, loaded, rendered, visual rendered, error, and then you're able to kind of create this map with the name of the event and then your callback function. And then down below here, you kind of saw that, as you embed the report, you can just point it to your map. So if you find that this component, is helpful to use, please go ahead and use that. But once again, just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of the Power BI React component that the Power BI team has created for everyone to use. And that, Kelly, would be the summary of what we're going to talk about today. It's introducing React.JS and then giving you a sample that hopefully you can load in and get running. And it might get you started just with a great way to create single page applications that implement Power BI embedding.
Wow, that was a lot of content, a lot to think over. I think the attendees don't have any other questions, but if you do, I think we've got another minute or so that we can stay on and answer them. If you do, thank you so much, Ted. Again, always learning from you every time I attend these dev camps. So we'll give it about a minute for folks to type up any questions that they might have.
Absolutely.
Hey, Ted, did we put all of the links in the chat window as well? I put the blog, and also we have your Power BI Dev Camp blog. So I've got the Power BI blog, your Dev Camp blog.
I can put them all in at once just for a handy thing that everyone hopefully will have.
That would be fantastic.
Okay, so there, I should have put some more line breaks in there. But the first one is just the Power BI JavaScript API. The second one is the repository for my demo that I showed you how to get up and running. And then the last one is a link to the repository where the Power BI team has stored their React component for Power BI embedding.
Excellent. Okay. It doesn't look like we have any other questions, so I think we can call it a day today. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We really appreciate you spending your time with us today.
We certainly do.
We love your content, Ted, and we wish that for all of you have a safe and happy holiday and an exceptional new year. And Ted, why don't you close?
Well, once again, I'll wish everyone a happy holidays, and don't forget the next session in January, and it's back to the last Thursday in January. We can't do the last Thursday with Thanksgiving and December, but now we're back to the last Thursday, and we're covering developing custom visuals. Once again, Node.js and NPM and TypeScript are essential figures there. So once again, thanks everybody. Have a great holiday season, and we'll see you back in Power BI Dev Camp in January.